I would like to, before I begin, just acknowledge Maria Simonelli, who is here looking after the twins, who are 3 months old. Apologies if there's some screaming in the background, but we'll get through.
This is about women's art and women's lives, so it's okay.
I know. I feel good about it.
Yeah.
I'm pleased today to speak about the inimitable Elizabeth Winwood. And our first slide shows her very radiant sculpture in the AGO's collection, that's in the uninvited exhibition, of course, called Northern Island. This was created around 1927, so the artist was the age of just 24, and she was a recent graduate of OCA, where she studied with Arthur Lismer and J.E.H. MacDonald. So by this time, she was already forging an artistic practice that was in keeping with trends of landscape art of the day, and at the same time, really radically breaking away from them. And what's really radical is that she was taking the landscape genre and translating it into 3 dimensions, and doing so with the use of unconventional and industrial materials. So you can see here her aesthetic is very streamlined. It was inspired by the likes of Brancusi and Moholy-Nagy, whose work she had likely seen in New York while studying, or in Buffalo in the mid-20s. Her forms are evocative of a machine. They're verging towards abstraction. And in this piece, she combines her really typical modernist austerity with the national icon of the windswept tree, our symbol of strength and resilience. So the piece is remarkable, although the scale is not heroic. It's, I'd say, a bit wider than my laptop. And Wood exhibited it the year after it was made at the National Gallery, and then at the Art Gallery of Toronto, now AGO, the following year. And I'd just like to share some of the very positive critical acclaim that she received. In the Yearbook of the Arts in Canada, Bertram Brooker described Wood's metal sculptures as inventive triumphs in casting, and, quote, that she stands alone in this country. And critic Jean Beatrice Salinger was also very positive, proclaiming in the Canadian Forum that Wood is leading, quote, the ultimate awakening of Canadian sculpture, unquote. So we'll go to the next slide, please. In this piece, Reef and Rainbow, Wood tackles a very similar subject, although it's a bit more inventive because she's sculpting the ephemeral elements of a cloud and a rainbow. This piece is bigger, it's about 1 meter long, and it's similarly very streamlined, evocative of a machine. And I'd really like to highlight her use of pure tin as a sculptural material. Excuse me. Unlike tin alloys like pewter, the pure tin keeps a mirror-like appearance after solidifying, and this piece is just really, really brilliantly reflective and so beautiful. At the time, tin was a very surprising choice of material. It's typically associated with industry and not fine art. And this was really part of Wood's working method, to employ this material that has associations with Canada's primary resource industries. You know, the use of the material was in itself a symbol of modernity and progress. So we'll move on to the next slide, please. These are Wood's beautiful drawings. Sarah has a really wonderful selection in the exhibition, and I find them really fascinating because they show both her dedication to landscape as a genre, but also the discipline of sculpture. The pine trees and the islands take on monumental shapes, and they really show her confidence in depicting organic forms with transitions of light and shade. Mm-hmm. So she would reference these drawings while making her sculptures. The drawing on the far right, I actually had the opportunity to see at with Wood's relatives in Orillia, along with Sarah Milroy and John Gagan, who are both here on this panel. We had spent a really wonderful afternoon with the family, and Sylvie Brown is in attendance, so thank you for being here, Sylvie. We saw so many wonderful things that day, but this drawing of the outhouse kind of stayed with me because I think it's a testament to that time she spent on the land up north, and to just kind of how comfortable she was in the outdoors. Mm-hmm. Excuse me. So when we look at Wood's island sculptures and drawings, it's interesting to note that she was actually born on an island in a small cabin that her family called the Wood Box. So she had this, innate love for the region. And although she spent most of her adult life in Toronto, she really cherished those summers up north with her husband, fellow sculptor and former instructor at OCA, Emmanuel Hahn. So I'm going to speed on through to the next slide, please. So the photo on the left is Wood as a student at OCADU, or OCA as it was then known, and she was probably about 20 years old. Interesting tidbit, around this time she started signing her name Winwood on her pieces, and Win is actually a shortened version of her middle name, which is Winifred. So you can see she's thinking about how she'll be portrayed as a professional artist, and the name Winwood seemed to be more alluring to her. I wanted to include this photograph of her as a counterpoint to the not so flattering caricature in the bottom right, where she's depicted as quite severe. But I thought it would be important in the context of this panel on landscape to include this article from 1937 called Art and the Precambrian Shield. And perhaps this will be good fodder for our discussion around landscape today. The article was written in response to historian Frank Underhill's attacks on the symbolic purity of the group of seven in the landscape genre more generally. He was frustrated that artists weren't portraying the social realities of, the Great Depression. Rather, they were focused on these really kind of wondrous landscapes. And in response, Wood writes that Canadian artists should continue to lean, quote, very heavily upon the wilderness for spiritual stimulation and nourishment. And she really suggests that the landscape genre is not a place for the propagation of ideologies, but it itself should function as an enrichment of life. So I'm sure many of you know Parasceva Clark responded quite heatedly to this article, writing her own response that really champions showing social realities in art, which of course is based in her Russian heritage. And this is written about very eloquently by Jocelyn Anderson and Pena Clark Espinal in the Uninvited catalog. And I know that Parasceva's writings also influenced Sarah Milroy early on. So a big debate between Underhill, Wood, and Clark, which continued into the 1940s and actually evolved into a broader discussion on how government could shape a national culture in the 1940s. So I'll end here by positing that Elizabeth Winwood is a complex and fascinating figure in Canadian art history. She had a very strong allegiance to the landscape genre early on, and for that reason is perceived by some as conservative or perhaps even naive, as she really subscribed to the colonial values of the group of seven, which ignored social realities in favor of a more nationalistic art. At the same time, though, she was progressive, not only in her incredible work as an advocate for the arts. She was on various committees. She championed women in the arts. She really did fight for a modern vision of Canadian art, but she was perhaps even more progressive in the way she used new materials like tin to sculpt the landscape in 3 dimensions in a way that really no other sculptor was doing at the time in Toronto. So I will leave it there and look forward to joining you all in the discussion.